Hello, welcome to another edition of Curtis Jones Writing. We're on the book called Getting There, and uh, today we're going to read Chapter 2, The Beaver Hunt. This is a story that I credit Grandfather for telling me. He didn't tell me much of this story, but my Uncle Dick gave me a lot more detail. His grandpa, his grandpa's younger brother. I guess he was the baby of the family, but I really did like Uncle Dick a lot. Uh, Side note, he died when he was in his 40s, and they rolled him from the emergency room in the hospital to the morgue portion of the hospital. But he wasn't really dead. He woke up 2.5 hours later in the morgue and sit up in bed and went out. And then they found him and they treated him. Things like that happen a lot more often a long time ago because when people died, they didn't draw all the blood out and put formaldehyde in their bodies. By doing that, people will never wake up. Uh, there's a lot of stories I could tell about that, what my grandfather told me, but I won't bother with that. But Uncle Dick filled in all the highlights from this story for me, and I attributed it to Benjamin Harrison Jones, who was my grandfather, and Dick was his baby brother. Okay, let's start. It's called The Beaver Hunt, a working family vacation. And I start off talking about me. I lived in a small community called Tahlequah, Oklahoma. We lived about 5 miles north of the town in a valley called Steely Holler. This valley was narrow and ran north for about a mile and a quarter, and we lived about halfway up this valley. Dad had a 30-acre farm where he farmed okra, and he also worked at a lumber yard in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was about 50 miles from home. Uh, we kids went to a little school called Lozier B. It was a little country school, 2 rooms, and outside was a building where they cooked for our lunch. This little valley was a good place to live, but like everything else, it had its drawbacks. This day was a cold and gray winter day, and I was on my way home from school. It had snowed while we were at school. I walked with my two sisters and several other children to a 2 room schoolhouse, which was about 3 miles from our house. I had to walk past my parental grandfather's house on the way. Our house was about a half mile from Grandpa's house. Uh, in the warm weather, Grandpa would stand outside and wave and say hi as we went to school and came home from school. But on this day, he was inside by the wood stove, keeping himself warm. And I decided I would stop at Grandpa's and warm myself by his fire. I would also tell him how awful it was to have to do what we kids had to do, walk 3 miles to school. But it was not uphill both ways. Let me get that straight. Grandpa said, "Come on in and warm yourself, and the other kids if they want to." They knew that Mom uh, wanted us to just walk home and not stop anywhere when we got out of school. They went on, but I went into Grandpa's house and sat by the fire and held out my hands to warm to the warm stove to thaw out my fingers. Grandpa said that my ears were as red as tomatoes from that cold. I thought that this was a good time to do my complaining, so I looked up at Grandpa with the biggest blue eyes I could muster, and I said that I was so sad and that it was the worst day ever. I wished that things were different. The cold weather and the 3 mile walk to school was so difficult for a 9-year-old boy. I was angry because I was made to walk 3 miles in cold weather and snowy weather. A little boy should never have to walk so far anyway, I said. That day I learned that it could always be worse, and we should be happy with such things as we have. Grandpa said that the Bible told him that that he now believes. Oh, so let me back up. I learned that day that it could always be worse. We should be happy with such things as we have. Grandpa said that the Bible told him that, and he now believes it. Grandpa said, "Let me tell you a little story of something that happened to me when I was 9 years old." I sat with my hands and feet held to that old stove as the heat brought the color back to my hands, and I watched his mouth as he began to speak of times past and things that were. As he spoke, the whole world around me faded away. I became engrossed in his story of woes and pain and of great adventures in far off places. Time itself seemed to stop, and I was transported to what Grandpa was describing. He used such detail, and what was missing in his description was filled in nicely by my own imagination. The best I remember, this is the story Grandpa told me on that cold, windy winter day. He said it was the spring of 1898, and it had been a hard, cold winter that year, too. The spring came late that year before, and the winter had stayed or started early that year before, too. The growing season had been cut short for the year before that was before that year as well. He said, "We spent a night in bed hungry. We spent many a night in bed hungry because there was just too little to eat for a family of 7. There was scarcely a penny to be found in the whole country where we lived. Times were hard all over," he told me. We weren't the only ones having to deal with this. This was Indian Territory at that time. It did not become a state until 1909. My dad, he said, was Johnny Jones, your great grandpa. He also did some farming to take care of his family and earn a little extra cash. But this year was especially bad, and there was no cash to be had. He said our neighbor next door had a son that had spent the year before that in old Mexico trapping beavers and had come home with almost $800 cash money. That was 2 or 3 years' income for us, Grandpa said. He said Dad began to talk to Mom and said he wanted to take the covered wagon that they had and to go down there and spend the year trapping beavers and sell them and then return home the next year. I Grandpa said, heard Mom say if he was going, the whole family would be going with him too. I remember that for about a week. There was a lot of talking between Mom and Dad. The next thing I knew, we were putting together what we would need to spend a year away. Dad said that the neighbor would watch the house and take care of whatever needed to be done. Dad sold the milk cow and he sold the mule that he used for farming, and we kept the team of horses to pull the wagon. Within a few days, we were ready to go to Old Mexico and get rich from beaver pelts. I remember how excited everyone was. I thought it was a great adventure, Grandpa said, which I would always remember. Dad always called me Ben, and he said, Ben, you and Dick and Maggie will be walking alongside the wagon, and the two babies will ride with Mom and me. Dick and I were close, and Maggie was a girl, and we knew she could not keep up with us. She mostly walked beside the wagon. Dick and Maggie were both older than me. We loaded the cook stove and the bed for Mom and Dad, bedrolls for us kids, our clothes, utensils, and what we had in food storage. We had some canvas we could spread at night to give some protection from rain. The canvas hooked to the top of the wagon and spread about 15 foot. It was longer than the wagon, and so it made a wall at one end. The other canvas was the floor we used to put our bedrolls on. We would start about an hour after daybreak in the morning and stop about an hour before dark. Mom cooked on an open fire, and Dad would kill something for meat along the way, or before Mom cooked in the evening. She always cooked something for lunch, so we didn't have to stop. We seemed to eat better on the trip than we did at home before we left. I think everyone was happy when we started this long trip. As we went, Dick and I would run ahead and look at the interesting sights and the animals as we would see along the way. Sometimes we found things we had never seen before. A horned toad was one of those things. Did you know that they could squirt blood out of their eyes? It was great fun for the first 2 days. We were on an adventure of a lifetime. We did not think about the 1,100 miles we would be walking. You see, I was only 9 years old too. I had to walk all the way to the Sierra Mountains in Old Mexico, and I had to walk all the way back within about a year and a half, he said. As Grandpa spoke, he would stop every once in a while and tell me to close my mouth or I might catch a fly. I was so amazed at the idea of walking 2,200 miles, and I thought about how I would be sad about 3 miles of walking. Back to what Grandpa was saying, I could hardly believe that a toad had horns and could squirt blood out of his eyes. In my imagination, it was a creature that had horns like a goat or and orifices to spray blood out of its eyes. He said we would walk with the wagon until we could see something of interest to us, and we would run ahead and get engaged in some side adventure. Mom would soon be calling from the wagon telling us to catch up. She worried that we might be left behind somewhere. Many times on the trip down, we were in areas where there was no hills and no streams to play in. Those times made the trip harder to enjoy, and that's the kind of place is where we found the horned toads. One day, after about 5 weeks of traveling, Dad said we had just entered Old Mexico. We had passed through Fort Worth, San Angelo, and we thought we were about halfway there. We were not even close to halfway. When time was considered, it took another 8 weeks to get where we were going. This traveling was much harder, and we had to watch for bandits. We went to a place called San Francisco del Oro. It was harder when we were in Mexico because so few people spoke our language. It was hard to get supplies and learn information about where to trap beavers or where we might go to stay for the time we would spend there. Dad had always worried about banditos, but we had never saw any of the whole time we were in Mexico. I think that they were in the east where the gold fields were. Dad found a nice little valley and we built a small log cabin. Mom set up housekeeping, which took about 3 weeks. We kids had to do gardening and help with traps Dad built for the beavers. We were able to grow some vegetables before the cold set in. We dried what we could and saved for the winter months when the beavers would be easier to trap. Beaver meat is not bad when you uh, get used to it, Grandpa said. It always seemed to be tough, though. The year was not easy in Mexico, and we worked very hard. We kept mostly to ourselves because we did not speak the local language. We kids didn't have any friends because we lived so far out. We didn't have any neighbors except an old white man called Lonesome Johnson. We just called him Lonesome. He had a hat made of beaver with its tail still attached. We kids liked it when he came around. Dad said it made him nervous. He uh, came by every once in a while. He lived about 10 miles west in another valley. He said that the beavers were mostly trapped out here, but there were still a few left around. We could not have gotten any help if anything had gone wrong. Mom worried about that and told us to be careful of what we did. The winter in Mexico was cold also, and we'd have snow in the mountains as well. The cabin wasn't as warm as our house back in Oklahoma. We soon became tired of this place, and Dad trapped only a few beavers all year and not $800 worth. We thought it would be warmer in old Mexico, but the mountains were not warm, and the house we lived in barely kept the wind out, but not the cold. We heated the cabin with the cook stove. The old wood heater stove was still in Indian Territory back home. When spring came that year, Dad sold the beaver pelts and collected $41, and the traps was going to take over a year when we finished. From the time we left home, it would take over a year before we got back. When it was all said and done, we were worse off than if we had not gone. And we still had the trip back home to go. I still had 1,100 miles to walk, and I was only 10 years old then. Dick and I would help Dad more on the trip back home than we did on the trip out. We could set the canvas on the wagon and have it ready for Mom to cook and set the evening bedrolls out. We also became strong walkers to keep up with the wagon without effort. We still had plenty of side adventures, and we remember where we could get a quick swim when it was hot. We talked Dad into setting up camp about 3 one afternoon, and where Dick and I had found a creek full of crawdads, good eating to a young boy, and they reminded us of Indian Territory back home. On the way home, we found three places where they had put new roads through and put in telegraphs. Mom and Dad talked about the great changes coming to this land. Dick and I found three rattlesnakes and killed them for supper one day. We carved sticks with a fork at one end and held the heads until we could kill them. We cut the heads off and pulled the skins over the length of the body and cut the meat away just before the rattle. We then stuffed them full of sand. It was easy to find snakes in the spring when they hid under the blackberry bushes to catch mice. We carried them around for days and played with them as though they were toys. They still rattled, and Mom made us keep them away from the horses. It frightened them so, and Mom was afraid that they would spook and run. When we crossed the Red River, we spent 2 days there celebrating. We were glad to be back in Indian Territory. We were still many days from home. This traveling would be much easier because there were creeks and rivers everywhere. We passed by Fort McAllister and on up to Muskogee, where we crossed the Arkansas River on a ferry. We spent the night there, and the next day would make it home. We got an early start about daybreak and got home about dark. It took about 3 years before we got another milk cow. A milk cow supplies a lot of what we need for groceries. We never got a mule again. We just used a team of horses from then on for our farming work. Grandpa said, Curtis, remember that as bad as things seem to be, they could always be worse, and that others may not be as well off as you are. I went home after the story was finished, and Mom was waiting for me. I did get a good sound talking to for not coming straight home as I had been told to do. I looked at it in retrospect, and I think the story Grandpa told on that cold winter day was worth the scolding I received. I did learn not to do that again because Mom's scolding really hurt my feelings. I hope you enjoyed this story. I will do The Little Jet, which is a story I made up. It didn't fit in any of the other books, but I wanted to publish it anyway. So that'll be the next one I do in this book, probably tomorrow or the next day. But I'll try to keep posting until I get all the way through this book. God bless you and take care of you. If you want to get ahead of me in these stories, or you want to look at some of the stories I've already read, because I think this is my seventh or eighth book, I don't remember. And you could go to my webpage, which is curtis-jones-books at squarespace.com, and there's a link that'll take you to Amazon where you can get all of my books. There's 14 of them there, and all of them come in ebook form, and they all come in paperback, but some of them come in hardback if you want to give them for gifts. God bless you, keep you, and take care of you. And if you get a chance, tell your stories to your children. They will remember them. Take care. Be careful. Until next time. Bye bye.